Today's sponsor is Advancement Courses. Stay tuned at the end of the show for a special coupon for 20% off any of their grad level professional development courses. 5 Ways to Overcome Cognitive Overload, episode 325. The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today. Cognitive overload, what is it, and how do we work with it in our students and in ourselves? Today, Todd Finley is going to help us understand this. And I know Todd from writing also with Edutopia. And Todd, thank you for being with us today. And what is cognitive overload?
Cognitive overload, it comes from experimental research that shows how too much information, too much stress, too much complexity taxes working memory. And working memory is super important to understand. It's a mental sticky note or a scratch pad that we use to keep track of info until we use that info in some ways. So if we are recalling directions or writing a sentence or doing a math problem where we need working memory. So an example of this might be if I say, put these numbers in order, 66, 33, 22, 28, and a child is experiencing cognitive overload or they just have poor working memory, that child might not remember the numbers and they might not even remember what to do with them.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you reach that limit, sometimes you'll just do a brain dump and you just don't remember a thing and you get confused, don't you?
Mm-hmm. My wife thinks that she has a problem with it, but I just say, compare what you're doing now as a teacher and how much complexity there is in what you're doing compared to what you were doing when you were 22. There's no comparison. So it's not senile dementia. It's just that teachers are doing far more now than ever before.
Yes, we are. Okay, so what are some of the ways to reduce cognitive overload when we realize that students are overloading? We've just, I've heard teachers say, I just gave you 8 directions, and how come you don't remember any of them? Well, that might be cognitive overload. So how do we deal with this and help kids?
Well, the first thing is to notice when it's occurring. So, and sometimes you'll have a parent that'll say, the directions go in one ear and out the other ear, and they think the kid's not paying attention, but that can actually be a sign of cognitive overload or poor working memory, not an attention issue. But like one of my favorite look-fors for identifying cognitive overload is when you have a kid you ask them a question and their eyes start twitching back and forth rapidly. That's a sign of real stress on working memory. And you'll actually see kids naturally do something that's useful, which is sometimes they'll cover their eyes, they'll kind of shield their eyes and look down. And the reason they're doing that is because for some reason, human beings, when they're looking at the face of another human being, that takes up a whole lot of bandwidth in the brain. And so by looking down, they're trying to access more RAM in their brain in order to solve the problem. But that's an indication that you need to be doing some things to simplify the information or chunk the information. And there's some general things that you can do for cognitive overload. And the most famous one is scaffolding. But I don't really like the word scaffolding because I think when teachers hear that term, they think of building something when actually scaffolding is really about simplifying or narrowing things in the same way that if you have a trail that minimizes the choices for hikers so that they can summit more successfully. Or another example of limiting choices is a lot of parents will ask their kids, so what'd you do today? And that's an overwhelming question for kids. Like, what do you mean what I did today? What did I eat? What happened during this time of the day? So you can play the high-low game, which is what we did with our family. What was the high point and low point of the day? So that narrows the choices, but it also allows them to focus and be more successful in the task.
You said their eyes twitch back and forth. You mean like look back and forth, horizontally typically, or just seeing their eyes move rapidly?
It's usually left and right rapidly.
Okay.
Sometimes I've seen that with a mix of sort of up and down. You can sort of see them accessing different quadrants.
Yeah.
But mostly it's left and right. And sometimes you'll see pupil dilation with that too. But I'm never that close enough to a student to actually see that.
Wow. Okay. So because that explains a lot to me. I've seen that before and didn't really understand it. I'm actually thinking about a student that I saw it with yesterday and I'm going, oh my goodness. So We've got scaffolding or really simplifying, helping minimize choices, noticing when it happens. What else can we do?
So another thing that you can do is to maintain what I call a simple learning cockpit. So aerospace companies now, they recognize that cockpits with all these switches is completely visually overwhelming for pilots and can create overload in stressful situations. And so they're trying to simplify those cockpits now. In the same way, kids need time to organize their learning cockpits, their desks or notebooks and pencils and papers. They actually need time in straightening things. And that's really important for reducing cognitive overload.
Oh, my goodness. And so many times we don't give kids the opportunity to just kind of get themselves organized. I mean, I've seen kids come in and say, okay, I just need to get a minute to get my head on straight. And that's what they're doing, huh?
Absolutely. And I think teachers are feeling pressure to hurry students through the day, hurrying them into line. And I think that's because they feel pressure to cram more into the day because there's so much pressure on teachers. But they actually need to give room for students to process things and just step back a little bit. And then you'll have less friction in the class between kids as well.
Wow. Okay. What else can we do?
Another thing is to provide time for reflection. And I had a student this year, and I was talking about some principle, and I was about to go to the next thing. And she said, it'd be great if you gave us time to talk about how this applies to our lives. And I thought, okay, this is Captain Obvious, like, of course. And do we realize that there's no learning without reflection? And if we are giving students time to reflect, what happens then is that tenuous knowledge that they have in working memory, their neural pathways become strengthened, and they're able to convert that short-term information into long-term memory. So reflection is really important.
Absolutely. And what have you learned? What can you do? And even when you make a mistake, what have you learned so that you can improve, whether it's a mistake in learning or a decision or that sort of thing? Such great ideas. Okay, what's next, Todd?
This is an idea from Sheila Valencia. She's a University of Washington expert in literacy. She says one of the problems that kids have when they are reading textbooks, particularly in secondary, are super complex. The writing is complex, and so is the content sometimes. And so if students are like me when I was in high school, I would read every single sentence like they were equally important, and they aren't. And students need some clues about what's important and what's not important. So saying things like, tonight when you're reading, really pay attention to this part because I'm going to ask you about this the next time that we meet. So providing some road signs and indications of what's important is useful. And teachers can do this in other ways too. They can enunciate certain things that are really important, or they can use repetition. All of those are really good ways of reducing cognitive overload.
Yeah, and front-loading vocabulary is a really important one. I mean, that's one I use a lot, where they actually know these are the important concepts we're learning.
Yeah, that's really critical.
And what else were you going to say?
Teachers are facing cognitive overload right now. And, so the indications of that are if you start feeling fuzzy or you find that your planning is inefficient, just teachers start to become super inefficient this time of year. And that's because they're tired out from the entire year and there's a lot of pressure and stress in the air. And I think teachers need to be aware that they're operating on these emotional and intellectual dimensions of students' brains. And so they need to give themselves a little bit of a break. But there's a few things that can help them not feel so overloaded. So one is when you're feeling overloaded, just step back from the notion of tyranny of coverage, where you feel this massive pressure that you need to cover all this stuff before it's too late with kids. And just say to yourself when you're walking into the classroom, what is the one or two critical things that kids need to know this class when they walk out of the door? So that's one of the things. And then also when I talk to teachers, I don't see a lot of them who can describe their planning. They're not really conscious of how they plan lessons. They just kind of do it. But sometimes if you're a teacher and you find yourself, you're sitting down and you keep checking social media and you can't quite seem to get started, you're probably experiencing some overload. So before you sit down to plan, actually having a plan to plan, a checklist of how you're going to approach things, that will help you be more efficient and reduce the stress.
And sometimes I'll put on headphones and listen to music and kind of get in a frame of mind to be able to plan. The one thing the headphones do is they, in some ways, keep me tethered to my desk so that I'm not tempted to get up and do something else.
I have those Bose noise canceling headphones.
Yeah.
And I use them. I think they're actually a cue, and I have my soundtrack of music that has no words in it, and after a time I'll realize that I've had the headphones on for 2 hours without anything going through them. So that can get you started listening to certain kinds of soundtracks, and then once you're in it, the hardest thing with all of this stuff is starting. Once you're into it, then you're good to go.
It is. So, Todd, as we finish up, can cognitive overload actually look a little like ADD?
It can, and it gets confused with ADD. I was just reading some research on this recently, and the brain is so complex that sometimes the indicators are the same, and you can have a kid with cognitive overload and ADHD as well. But I think what I'm learning is that the problems with working memory is something that we are underdiagnosing and calling it something else. Behavior problems, or kids just not focusing or not caring or being apathetic, when it's actually that they're experiencing memory loss very, very quickly. And there are some things that teachers can do to help with that. You can build working memory capacity by having students teach you something. You can have them say to picture things in your head like instructions, or even games like Uno are really useful for building memory capacity. And there are programs that exist too that help with that.
Wow, there's so much we can dig into here. I think, teachers, the important thing to understand is to realize that cognitive overload does happen. It happens to you. It happens to me. It happens to our students. Just because somebody is having trouble focusing does not mean that it's ADD. And I have 2 kids with learning differences, and I know working memory is a factor there for one of them. And so I totally get and understand this. And it would really frustrate me when teachers would give these massive multi-part directions with I gave you 10 verbal instructions and you forgot them all. And I think that it's important for us to remember that, working memory can change with age, but all kids have different working memory. And sometimes we can have a different working memory as well. And just depending on, just how much is coming at us, I find it real easy to overload. So these are great tips. Todd also has a lot of great resources at his website, todd-finley.com. He's got a lot of articles on Edutopia, and it's just a fantastic educator to follow. As you can tell, he's kind of opens our minds, and I've got a lot of stuff to look for, especially this, the eyes darting back and forth. That is a huge one. I'm so excited to be able to read that facial body language, because I think that's such an important part of being a teacher. So teachers, get out there and let's try to apply this now, this week. Let's notice cognitive overload and see what we can do about it. Thanks for listening. Need some great professional development? Today's sponsor, Advancement Courses, has more than 200 graduate-level online professional development courses for K-12 teachers. You can take these courses for continuing education, salary advancement, or recertification. And these courses have us teachers developing tangible resources to use in our classrooms immediately. Go now to advancementcourses.com/coolcat and use the code COOL20 at checkout to get 20% off any course. With this coupon, a 3 grad credit course is only $359. So go to advancementcourses.com/coolcat to learn more and use the coupon code COOL20. Never stop learning. Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.